Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill, the show where we talk about bitter pills of truth that the corporate media doesn't want you to know about and people don't want to swallow. So, today I'm going to talk about an issue that's been very much in the news recently, not necessarily in the corporate media, but been trending number one on Twitter at times, and that is the debate over whether to force the vote on Medicare for All in the House of Representatives. And basically, the idea is that let me show you this great article from Brianna Joy Gray here about it. This idea introduced by comedian and YouTube host Jimmy Dore back in late November was to try to advance the Medicare for All movement by refusing to re-elect Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House unless she brings Pramila Jayapal's Medicare for All bill to a floor vote in the House. And basically, the reason why Jimmy proposed this strategy is that the House or the Democrats didn't do so well in the elections back in early November. They only have a slim majority in the House, whereas they had, I believe it was about a 30 person majority last time. And so, ironically, that creates a situation where progressive Democrats in the House have more power because Nancy Pelosi is up for re-election as Speaker of the House, and in order to be elected Speaker of the House, you have to get a majority of the votes for House of Representatives, for Speaker of the House, I mean, and just a small handful of people could withhold their vote from Nancy Pelosi, and she wouldn't get a majority of Speaker of the House. And so that provides the opportunity to make demands on her, to say, my vote for you is contingent on you doing this. And this, in this case, as Jimmy proposes, is that she has to use her power as Speaker of the House to bring Pramila Jayapal's bill to the full House for a vote. Right now it's bottled up in committee, as has every bill to bring about a national health insurance single-payer Medicare for All type system in the United States ever since the first such bill was introduced back in the early 90s by, I believe it was Jim McDermott, I forget, but in any case, there's never been a floor vote on Medicare for All in the House as far as I've been able to find out. So this would be a significant milestone historically for this to be actually voted on in the House of Representatives. Doesn't mean it would pass this time, but it would still bring a lot of attention to it. There'd be an open discussion in the House, which there's never been before, and it would provide possibly a better gauge than the number of co-sponsors on the bill, which I think stands at about 115 right now. It would provide a better gauge of support to see who actually votes for it than the number of co-sponsors. And let's see. Without a majority of votes in the House, the only way to bring a bill out of committee onto the floor where it can be publicly debated and then voted on by the full House of Representatives is if the Speaker of the House agrees to do so. When it comes to Medicare for All, Pelosi never has, and not only Pelosi, but no Speaker of the House ever has, nor has there been a majority vote to bring a Medicare for All type bill to the floor for a vote. Progressives worry that without a significant pressure campaign, elected Democrats will never be made to answer for why they stand well to the right of the public on the need for universal health care. And it's striking just how far to the right the Democrats stand relative to the general public on this issue. A recent poll by Fox News found that 72% of Americans support Medicare for All, including almost 90% of self-professed Democrats and over half of Republicans. So, as many or more Republicans support Medicare for All in the general public than proportionally the number of Democrats in the House of Representatives. Well, I guess it's about the same. Roughly half of the Democrats in the House have signed on as co-sponsors for the Medicare for All bill, although that doesn't necessarily mean that they actually support it. As we saw in the presidential primaries, a couple of the people who were co-sponsors of the Senate bill, Cory Booker and Kamala Harris, and also, frankly, at times Elizabeth Warren, went back on their support for Medicare for All. Ironically, one person who was accused of that, Tulsi Gabbard, never has. She's not only remained a co-sponsor, but continues to publicly advocate for it. But in any case, why is this being brought up? Can't we rely on people like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Pramila Jayapal, who wrote and introduced the bill, Rashida Tlaib, and other members of the squad, or progressive members of Congress in general? Why can't we just rely on them to push this issue, since they have been on the record many times as supporting Medicare for All? Well, that's one thing I want to talk about today. Sorry, I was trying to show you that article. Here you go. I will put a link to this in the notes for the video. Case for forcing a floor vote on Medicare for All by Brianna Joy Gray. It's in Current Affairs magazine, and I will definitely link to that. So, a lot of liberals and progressives believe that progressive Democrats in Congress, such as Bernie Sanders and AOC and Tulsi Gabbard, Omar Tlaib, etc., can be depended on to fight in a principled manner for what's right. And I believe that without exception, this belief is naive. There are certainly examples of politicians such as Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib standing up for Palestinians and against U.S. backing for the apartheid state of Israel that is oppressing the Palestinians. Tulsi Gabbard outspokenly advocating for freedom for Julian Assange, putting forth a bill to abolish the Patriot Act, taking a strong stand in many ways throughout her time in Congress against the U.S.'s warmongering foreign policy. Those are just a couple of many examples you can point to of specific instances where politicians in Congress have taken what arguably you could say is a principled and courageous stance on specific issues. But, there are far too many examples of Democrats, abdicating a principled stand So, for example, all but Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib have at one time or another expressed support for Israel. Even though some of the more progressive Democrats, such as Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders, have criticized Israel in various ways. All of the members of the progressive coalition in Congress have, they endorsed Joe Biden for president. None of them stood up for Tara Reid, who accused Joe Biden of raping her back in the early 90s, or for any of the other women in any significant way. Have any Democrats of any sort of national prominence stood up for any of the women who've accused Joe Biden of some form of sexual harassment or assault. So basically, in this election, despite Joe Biden having a lot of serious allegations by women against him, Democrats have thrown Me Too under the bus. And by voting for the CARES Act back at the beginning of the pandemic, they've also pretty much thrown the general public under the bus by passing this bill that gave massive bailouts to Wall Street and other corporate interests. They were supposed to help small business through loans make it through the pandemic, but most of the money wound up going to big corporations. They did give pretty good unemployment benefits, but for everybody else, it was a paltry $1,200 that was somehow supposed to last people who maybe weren't even eligible for unemployment, so were SOL. It was supposed to somehow last them the entire remainder of the year. Lots of people are facing bankruptcy or are facing eviction. 15 million people have lost their health insurance during this pandemic as a result of losing their jobs and thus their employer-tied healthcare plan. In many ways, this is a major crisis, which, as many crises do, provides an opportunity for progressive policy changes to be, at least pushed for, if not enacted, in ways that can build, a movement for them. And certainly, Medicare for All. What could be a more obvious time to push for Medicare for All than the midst of a pandemic that has created all sorts of economic chaos, including 15 million people losing their health insurance while we're faced with a virus that has killed over 350,000 people here in the United States and caused long-lasting health problems for many more than that. And there have been so many good bills, obviously the Medicare for All bills being one of them, that have never made it out of committee in Congress. So, for example, Tulsi Gabbard's All Fossil Fuels Act, the only comprehensive bill to address the damage resulting from climate change that's ever been put forward in the House. Because, there's a Green New Deal introduced by AOC and Ed Markey, but that's a resolution, not a bill. And although the name is the same as the Green Party's Green New Deal, it's very watered down from that, and is also inferior to Gabbard's All Fossil Fuels Act. But that's never made it out of committee. And just as an example of AOC's lack of a spine, she ran in 2018 on, among other things, supporting Gabbard's All Fossil Fuels Act, but then she's never mentioned it since she was, she's never mentioned it since she's been in Congress whatsoever, let alone co-sponsored it. And I made a tweet here, summarizing what I found by doing a Twitter advanced search about the political statements on Twitter of various progressive members of Congress. Tweets about Assange by the Squad, Sanders, or Jayapal, 0. Tweets about Bolivia's coup or dictatorship by Pramila Jayapal or Rashida Tlaib, 0. Opposition to CARES Act, none from any Democrat. They did a voice vote on it. The Senate approval of it was unanimous, but they did a voice voted in the House, which Tulsi Gabbard was absent from, so maybe she would have voted against it. Who knows? So they did a voice vote, so it would be impossible to tell or have a record of who voted for it and who against it. But you could hear the recording of the voice vote, and at least I only heard one voice opposing it, and it was the Republican who had demanded a vote on the record on it and been turned down. Other than Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, there's been no principled opposition to Israeli apartheid, despite her expressing criticism of Israel's massacres of protesters. For example, Tulsi Gabbard has refused to back BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. Same with Bernie Sanders. No support for Tara Reid. Bernie Sanders has engaged in a lot of Russiagating and other Cold War rhetoric. He's been bashing Venezuela using the same talking points that Donald Trump and his administration has. There's been a refusal, in fact, to call out Donald Trump on his war crimes by members of the progressive caucus in Congress to any significant extent. So the House impeached Trump over alleged blackmail of Ukraine, where supposedly in a phone call to the Ukrainian president, Trump threatened to withhold military aid from Ukraine unless they fired a prosecutor who supposedly was going to investigate the Biden family for their corruption involving Ukraine. But that was never really proven. I mean, if you look at the transcript of the phone call, at best it's very implied. And meanwhile, they ignored the fact that Donald Trump illegally, both in violation of international law and in violation of the U.S. Constitution, occupied Syria's oil and wheat fields in an attempt to strangle them economically as well as steal their oil. Only Tulsi Gabbard called him out for that and put forth a censure resolution that included that, and in contrast abstained from the impeachment resolution, which she felt didn't sufficiently criticize him and was being divisive with no political gain resulting from it. Anyway, none of the Squad backed abolition of the Patriot Act. They actually voted for it. Even on the issue of health care, progressive members of Congress have not been as much better as you would think. Most of them will say health care is a human right. All of them say they're for Medicare for All, but not a single one of them is truly fighting for it. Tulsi Gabbard, for instance, who was criticized for supposedly abandoning Medicare for All during her presidential campaign, but in fact supported a health care plan very similar to Australia's, which does provide Medicare for everyone, and it provides very high quality and affordable health care to Australians. But she was falsely accused of abandoning Medicare for All. Nonetheless, you have to say, it has to be said, she hasn't really said much about universal health care and the need for it this year. I couldn't find any record of her saying anything about it on Twitter. She did talk about it in campaign appearances, certainly, but that was a while ago. Many folks, Sanders and AOC and so forth, have spoken about the need for Medicare for All, but none of them have mapped out any sort of strategy for achieving it. And none of them have objected to the fact that there's never been a floor vote on Medicare for All. Because, although certainly few major social reforms pass in Congress the first time they're voted on, or necessarily pass in the Supreme Court or other courts the first time they're brought up, none of them do if they don't even vote on it at all. In contrast, there's no reason to think that losing a vote on Medicare for All would hurt. I believe in the UK, on 21 occasions, the National Health Service that they instituted many decades ago there was brought before Parliament and turned down before it finally passed. But let me give you a little information on the Force a Vote campaign and who's supporting it. There's a website developed, I guess, mainly by people associated with the Movement for a People's Party, forceavote.org, that has a petition you can sign and some information about the proposal. They say here, fewer than 15 House representatives, because of the narrowness of the Democrats' margin in the House, can determine if Medicare for All gets a vote by threatening to withhold their vote for Pelosi for House Speaker unless she commits to bringing Medicare for All to a floor vote, which she has the power to do. It's over 40,000 now. There's a petition on here that you can sign, and I'll put a link in the video description, that has 40,000 signatures on it, demanding that House progressives force a vote on Medicare for All. And among the people supporting this demand are not only Jimmy Dore, who launched it, who, interestingly enough, has been singled out for criticism by people who are trying to deflect from discussion of the proposal, it seems like, because they oppose it. The Los Angeles Chargers running back Jackson supports it, and in fact, initiated public discussion with AOC about it on Twitter, as do many other prominent figures on the left. Aaron Mate, Brianna Joy Gray, whose article I just showed you, Caitlin Johnstone, who's Australian but comments a lot on and writes a lot about U.S. Politics, Dr. Cornel West, Graham Elwood, Dr. Jeff Melton, thought I'd throw that in there, Katie Halper, Crystal Ball, Kyle Kalinske, and many, many others support this. Sorry, I seem to have lost the article that I wanted to show you. Hold on just a minute, I'm sorry. Oh, I should also mention about 15,000 people. Sorry, I should show you the website. I meant to show it to you. About 15,000 people tuned in the other night on the internet to a town hall about Force the Vote, featuring a lot of the people that I just mentioned and some others, some of whom, including Jimmy Dore, told their horror stories about how the lack of a universal taxpayer-funded health care system in the United States had harmed them. A woman who basically almost lost her sight. She's mostly blind because she couldn't get medical care, for example, couldn't afford it. And Jimmy Dore himself. I'm going to make another video about this where I look at some of the criticism of people who've been pushing this bill and look at some of those stories about you living in a country without a universal healthcare system and facing serious illness and financial problems and so forth as a result. But this time what I want to do is just lay out the case for pushing Force the Vote. And let's go back to Brianna's article. So, as I mentioned, Justin Jackson of the Los Angeles Charters brought up with AOC the issue of pushing for a vote on Medicare for All. He said, if AOC and the squad don't do what Jimmy Dore has suggested and withhold their vote for Pelosi for speakership, unless Medicare for All gets brought to the floor for a vote, they will be revealing themselves. Power concedes nothing without a demand, which is a famous thing that slavery abolitionist Frederick Douglass said many years ago. And AOC responded to him, although she curiously hasn't responded directly to anyone else involved with this movement, including the person who started it, Jimmy Dore. Problem with this idea is that there isn't enough thought given to step two. The Dem votes aren't there yet, and with a razor-thin margin, the Dem no's are greater than the margin. So you issue threats, hold your vote, and lose. Then what? If you want to know who's opposed, look at the co-sponsor list. Well, as I already mentioned, just because someone is a co-sponsor of a bill, although presumably most of them support it, that doesn't necessarily mean they do. And there's a little more pressure if it's a actual voting situation. If you're opposed to Medicare, you don't want it to actually pass, obviously. So if there's a chance that could happen, you're probably not going to vote for it. So it is a way of holding people in Congress more accountable than they have been held accountable thus far. But the problem with what AOC says here is that she's not giving any thought to step one. There hasn't been a vote on Medicare for All in the House ever. It needs to happen. That's part of the process of building a movement for Medicare for All to pass. It has to happen. And AOC not only disagreed with the scheme basically because it's unlikely to pass, but also she said that progressives could use leverage to push for things that can happen and change lives. As an example, she offered the prospect of passing a $15 minimum wage in the first 100 days. But as folks pointed out to her, the House has already voted on a $15 minimum wage. Joe Biden already supports a $15 minimum wage. It's in the Democratic Party platform. As Aaron Mate put it, well, I'll just read his whole tweet here. How does losing a vote on Medicare for All take away your leverage to push for things that can happen? You can still push for those things. And who are the longtime progressive champions who stand a chance to be elevated to those important positions of leadership? The legitimate question. There are none. Joe Biden hasn't appointed a single progressive to his cabinet. AOC herself was knocked out of a committee position by Nancy Pelosi just recently. What's the deal here? And he says, by the way, I don't understand how you're drawing a connection between progressive leverage and winning a $15 minimum wage. Biden already supports a $15 minimum wage. It won't take progressive leverage to hold him and Pelosi to something Biden already supports. It's the Senate that will decide it. Let's see. I'll post this article in the link to the video, but I'm not seeing anything here that I haven't covered already, other than some of the other controversy about it and just sort of off the wall, poorly thought out criticisms, which I'll get into next time. But one thing she points out that I do want to mention is that mass unemployment and the subsequent loss of employer-based coverage by approximately 15 million people has stripped corporate Democrats of one of their most potent arguments against Medicare for All, that maintaining the for-profit health system offers much desired stability. So you have a stable job that provides health insurance. You have health insurance, but oops, a lot of people's jobs aren't so stable, and if their health insurance is tied to their job, if they lose their job, they lose their health insurance. And a lot of people stay in jobs they don't want to stay in, or live in places they don't want to continue living in because they're afraid of losing their health care coverage. And another thing that this pandemic has done is expose the hypocrisy inherent in defenses of the current system, because party leadership, Democratic Party leadership, has admitted that COVID treatment ought to be free for all, and it's not. I had to pay $180 the other day, not for treatment because I don't have it, but for a COVID test because I don't have insurance. I haven't been able to afford insurance in almost 15 years. So they admitted, people shouldn't be bankrupted or forced to pay back exorbitant bills for COVID treatments. We have a pandemic. Lots of people are getting it who are not necessarily being totally reckless or anything. My son had it, and he was pretty careful. But if you admit that COVID treatment should be free for everybody, well, why shouldn't cancer treatment be free for everybody? Why shouldn't treatment for anything else be free, other than taxes, for everyone? Because right now, medical bills are the primary reason for bankruptcy in the United States. And you know how many other countries that's true in? Do you know how many other countries have medical bankruptcies at all among wealthier industrialized countries? Zero! None! Not a single one of them have that happening. So, the least we can do is have a floor vote and the debate that comes out of it. That could spark a referendum on our healthcare system at a moment where its failure is as obvious as it's ever been, and where this issue of the lack of universal health care is more prominent than it's ever been. And I just want to end this by just talking about by the way, I should mention I showed you the forcethevote.org website, and also if you want to get further involved in this movement, there's a Slack discussion forum forcethevote.slack.com that you can join and get involved with other activists who are pushing for this. But in any case, as I was saying, if you look, as I've talked about many times on this show, and I've written about many times, if you look at history, if you look at the history of progressive social change, whether it's the civil rights movement or the women's movement or the gay rights movement and the movement to demand that AIDS be taken seriously by the federal government, the environmental movement, the anti-slavery movement, labor movement in the 1930s. In every single one of these cases, the reason that progress was made on these issues was not because you had good Democrats in Congress or in the White House or whatever who just out of the goodness of their hearts enacted progressive legislation. That's not what happened. Franklin Roosevelt, for example, came into power as president in 1932, basically being a wealthy moderate, and the only reason the New Deal happened is that there was an enormous mass movement, during the midst of the Depression when so many people were suffering. There was an enormous mass movement to stop evictions, to form unions and demand a living wage, and so on and so forth. Demand that people have the right to a job. So all this pressure was brought to bear on the government by these movements, by these large strikes, for example, such as the sit-down strikes in factories in Flint, Michigan, and various other places throughout the Midwest. And many other things were happening that basically forced the hand of our government, forced them to enact the New Deal. And there were actually some terrible things that Franklin Roosevelt and the U.S. government in general did during that era, such as putting Japanese Americans in concentration camps, supporting dictatorships in Nicaragua and Spain and many other places. Certainly, Roosevelt was not nearly as labor-friendly as he was given credit for, and his successor, Harry Truman, even less so. Once the activism of the movements of the 30s died down, some of the most anti-labor legislation in history, in particular the Taft-Hartley Act, was passed by Congress and signed into law. But anyway, my point is, power concedes nothing without a demand. It's not, as Frederick Douglass said, now is a time, unlike what AOC would tell you, because we're in the middle of a pandemic, but apparently AOC would have it that power concedes nothing without a polite request, and that's just not the case. You don't get anywhere unless you use your power, which the Squad and other Democrats on the left side of things in Congress have the power to do. They have the power to make this vote happen, or at the very least to expose Pelosi as being so opposed to Medicare for All that she won't even allow for a discussion and vote to take place on the House floor. So this is an opportunity to show which side people are on, including not only politicians, but as we've seen and as I'll talk about in the next video, people in the people who label themselves leftists or progressives of some sort, some of whom are going out of their way to smear the more prominent supporters of this movement, such as Jimmy Dore and Brianna Joy Gray and others. And we need to call that out and say, look, this is not acceptable, and you are deflecting from the real issue here, which is that millions of people are suffering and hundreds of thousands of people are dying, partly as a result of this country's shitty healthcare system. So we've got to do something to change that. All right. Well, I've gone on for long enough for this time. So without further ado, let me end this here. Please like and share and subscribe. And comment below and let me know what you think. You go to the website, Force the Vote. Let's see, where is it? ForceTheVote.org. And sign the petition, do other things to get involved. Go to the Slack channel and get involved there. And if you're anywhere near DC or have an opportunity to get there within the next couple of days, go out to these protests in favor of Force the Vote. So until next time, this is Jeff Melton with a Bitter Pill. I will see you.